Welcome back. Thanks again for joining us for another episode as we continue walking through the through the Bible together. Right now, in the book of Genesis, we are in Genesis chapter number 17. We're coming to really the third episode in chapter 17 that deals with the reiteration of the Abrahamic covenant of God's promise to Abraham. And of course, 2 episodes ago, we recognized that God did change Abram's name from Abram to Abraham, really signifying that he would be a father of a lot of nations in that name change. And today we're going to see that he changes Sarai's name. And so we saw God's promise, his faithfulness to Abraham. He saw the condition that would come with it from Abraham and what he and his descendants are supposed to do in relation and obedience to their part of that covenant. Now today we're going to see really another finalizing of the promise. But the one thing I love about this section is he's been given the promise, he falls on his knees in worship to God. But then in that whole still thing, he still has questions. He's still from the human standpoint, as he's getting to speak verbally to God, in the human standpoint, still has a list of questions that just don't seem to humanly make sense. And by the way, they don't make human sense, which is where faith comes from. What God is doing here totally defies human laws, physics and biology and all the other things. It just defies it, and that's God's plan. We'll see that here. We'll even see Abraham's response to it. So let's go to Genesis chapter 17. We're going to begin in verse 15. It says, "And God said to Abraham, As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name." Now, why? Let me continue. Verse 16, "And I will bless her, and also give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples shall be from her." Now, it's important to say, first of all, her name was changed from Sarai to Sarah, Sarah being princess, giving the idea that she would be the mother of a large nation, of a large group of people, not necessarily through her servant, which is kind of how they processed it, which we'll learn a little bit is about 13 years ago. But this is literally, God says, it's going to come from her. Again, it's a promise. Again, and please understand, in a moment we're going to see Abraham's response to this. And there's going to be some questions from logic. One of the things I want to challenge you to consider before we move into Abraham's question is the fact that the questions he's about to ask, God knows the question, God knows the answers, God's not surprised by these things, but it doesn't stop Abraham from asking them. Sometimes I think in our journey, when we're wondering what God's going to do, we ask what we might consider, well, let me rephrase, we're afraid to ask, we might consider rhetorical questions. We trust God, we know God's doing something, but sometimes the process just doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, and I don't know why, but sometimes we get a little nervous. Maybe we feel like it's blasphemous to ask that question. The only person we're hiding, the conversation from is us. God knows our heart. In fact, if you read through the book of Psalms, multiple times, David asked the obvious question, talked about the elephant in the room. He very boldly went to God and said, "Why would you allow this?" This is part of that relationship with God where, we're not coming blasphemous. It's not that God owes us anything, but there is an open conversation. Because really, how are we going to learn about God? How are we going to learn about how God works in the process if we're not taking that step, if we're not growing in Him, if we're not willing to have that open conversation? Again, I don't think God verbally speaks to us today, but it's part of that honest conversation where now, as we're looking, we're getting that answer, and God does care enough for it. So we see that God states a fact, and it's in a moment we're going to see why this fact seems impossible. And then we see in verse 17, "Abraham then fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, Shall a child be born of a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" And Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." So Abraham laughs. He says, I think it says here, it says in his heart. I love the fact that even though it's in his heart, God is fully aware of what's going on here. So Abraham, he hears this. Now, please understand, this is not the first time that God has told Abraham what's going to happen. It's not the first time that God has says, "Hey, she's going to have a child." Now, I want you to understand a bit of the progression and why Abraham might have laughed, and yet he still had faith. He's still, from a human standpoint, saying, "God, as much as I trust you and have obeyed you, I don't think this is possible." Why? He's 100. He's 99 years old. She's 90. They are past childbearing ages. So from the human standpoint, it'd be like someone saying their great-grandmother's going to have a child. I mean, they've passed all of the physical capabilities to have a child. They're on the other end of it. And he's saying, wait a minute. Just from the human standpoint, this is impossible because she is unable to bear children anymore. It's just a simple point. My wife is unable to bear children. So Abraham is sitting there while God has said this, and God has said this multiple times. From the human standpoint, and this is just my opinion, my perspective of this, I wonder if Abraham over the years is saying, God, you've told me this multiple times, and all through the process of the time where Sarah was able to have children, she didn't. Now that she's not, you want to do this? It didn't make sense. It seemed, just think about this. How the physical ability for a woman at 90 to have the child. I mean, they lived older than 100, so it wasn't as old as it would be today. But the physical ability, can she do this? Will she live through labor? And then we've got to rear a child at this older age. All of these things are going through his mind. Maybe his old age would have been easier when we were in our 50s or 60s or 40s or whatever it is going through his mind. But he just gives the honest answer. And in his heart, he said, wow. Then he goes, why not Ishmael? I mean, and he goes back. This is the intriguing thing to me. He goes back to the same thought that he and his wife had that resulted in them having Ishmael. God, your plan, I know you want to say it, but I'm sorry, it's just not working. Why not Ishmael? Why do you have to make it more complicated? Maybe he's saying that. Again, I'm reading into it, my own opinion and perspective. But let's continue on to what God says. Verse 19, then God said, no. All right? First of all, he goes, why can't it be Ishmael? And God just flat out says, no. Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. Now, here's the thing that's intriguing in this passage. It goes beyond. All right, so before, he had said you'll have a son, he'll be the father of a great nation, all those different things. But at this point, now God begins to give Abraham specifics. He's going to tell him it is going to come from Sarah, not from someone else. 1. 2, here is his name. So now they're given some very specific details, which obviously should begin to add, I want to call it validity, but in Abraham's mind, well, this is not just promise that I'm looking down the road. Now I've been given some specifics on this. So, Sarah, your wife, will bear a son. You shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. And that's for Ishmael. So he finishes up. He says, Isaac is the promise. He's the one I told you about. His name, I'm going to continue my covenant through him. Because remember, there's 2 sons. He goes, now listen, as for Ishmael, I've heard you. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and multiply him exceedingly. He shall beget 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. So he goes, listen, I'm going to take care of Ishmael. He's going to be blessed. He's your son. And this is the intriguing part. Abraham steps outside of faith. Ishmael is the result of a lack of faith. Ishmael is the result, we can almost say it's a result of sin, because this is not something God told him to do. And we look at this, and this again, you see the grace and the mercy and the long-suffering nature of God, that Abraham points back to the son that God did not intend for them to have. It was outside of God's design, and he goes, no, I get it. I will still bless him. Now, again, we know later that Ishmael becomes a problem for the nation, but that's not the point. God still, it's just amazing to me that God's blessing, there are a lot of unintended consequences long-term that come to them because of it, but still God does this, and we see God's grace even to Abraham in this situation. But then we go to the final thought. He goes, I get that, but, verse 21, my covenant, what is important, what we're talking about, the promise I've given you, all the other stuff is beside. My covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this set time next year. Now, God's even more specific. God's saying he has his name. She's going to have the child next year. Then he finished talking with him, and God went up from Abraham. Now, verse 23 to 27 talk about the fact that Abraham went home. He went home and circumcised all of the men, including Ishmael, who at that point was 13. He went through and finalized his end, because the conversation's over. Abraham goes home and does his part and begins the process of the circumcisions of the people. And again, most of them were adults at this point when this is happening. We see Abraham's immediate promise. He walks away, giving the name, giving the time. So now we're like, it's getting closer. Sarah's going to be 91 when this happens. You look at this, you again see the faithfulness of God. And I love the fact that in all of this, even in Abraham's confusion, maybe Abraham said, I don't see how this is possible. And I think that's really where it comes from. Abraham's like, this is not possible. This is just not possible. And God's like, exactly. That's my point. And one of the things I will get from this, and all the things you can grab from the covenant and this conversation, is that in this situation you can see that a lot of times we look and say, God, the circumstances are too far. It seems like, in a lot of times, what we're afraid will happen does happen. Now, we've got this fear of these things happening, falling apart, losing a job, struggles at home, whatever it is. We're afraid, man, God, if you don't move this and this and this is going to happen. And then those things happen. And that becomes complicated because you say, but God, and here's the problem. Because we look at it and we say, if God is going to do right, if God's going to move, this is how it's going to happen. In God's plan, in Isaiah it says, his ways are not my ways, his thoughts are not my thoughts. And so many times we question God or maybe even get frustrated with God because his actions don't make sense to us. They're not to make sense. We stay trusting. We go to him, Lord, what can I learn? How can I grow? What do you want me to do in this circumstance? And then we trust God to move in a way that only God can be glorified from. It can never be seen as what we've done. It can only be seen as what God has done. I hope you keep your trust in him in that area, wherever you're at. Stay close, keep going, don't quit, don't give up. Whatever you can learn in your season, however you can excel and grow in your season, trust God and wait and see how God will honor his name and bless you through this season in your life. We do appreciate the privilege to be part of your day. Thank you for joining us today. Stick with us as we'll continue. We'll jump in to chapter 18 the next time we're together. Again, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again next time.